the stories in the book, and then also just sort of where things stand now with current trends in citizen science. But I will say first about Whewell, which I had to learn how to say his name too. It's British, Whewell. And he, but just to clarify, the year before he said artists were science and scientists, they were philosophers, and they were also called men of science. And he didn't want to call Mary Somerville a man of science. So he first called her a scientist. And so technically, the first scientist was a woman, just for the record. So anyway, so I'm curious if some of the students here are science students, if you can show hands or not. Some? Show not too many, actually. Okay. I was wondering. So my venture into citizen science really started, well, first I wanted to be a field biologist, and so I'm gonna have to lean and click open door because it's attached. So yeah, it's just that it's a lot of animations. But so I began really working with all kinds of animals in the field and in the lab, from grasshoppers to bears, to peregrine falcons, working in swamps, working with hawks, working with endangered owls, fighting fires, teaching children, driving school buses, all kinds of things, doing wildlife work, education, doing policy work, the Puerto Rican parrot, Bahama pintails, Kentucky warblers, black-footed ferrets, dabbling ducks, and doing my PhD fieldwork in Australia with these brown tree creepers. So my whole training through all the schooling, just decades and decades, I was like, I want to be a field biologist. I want to go in the field, collect data, study wildlife. That was everything I wanted to be. My idol was Jane Goodall. Are people familiar with Jane Goodall? She's iconic for scientists. And so that she sort of exemplified what I thought it meant to be a scientist, which was really that you get to work alone. I was not really a people person, so I liked the idea of just working with wildlife out in the field, out in nature, which was far away, right? It wasn't like where I lived, it was out in the wilderness. And then I thought, and then like Jane Goodall, that means that a person can use their individual passion and their clout to come back and help save species and habitats and do conservation work. And that it was a very elite thing that only a few people, could have that privilege of being like Jane Goodall, right, and the wildlife biologist. And so that was my framework for how science worked and how it all happened. And Jane Goodall even, combined her family life. She had a child when she was doing field work, and it seems natural and normal. Anyway, so when I was in grad school in Australia, far from home, finishing my field work, is when I started a family. And actually, I should say, so that little bird is called a brown tree creeper. Has anyone ever been to Australia? No one? Yeah. Some? Okay. So the bird life is amazing, right? They have sulfur-crested cockatoos and galahs and all kinds of parakeets and colorful birds. And this is a digression, but my husband is an astronomer, and so he looks at the stars. But we got to Australia, he finally was interested in birds because they were so beautiful and big. He said, which one's yours? Which one's yours? Like that little brown one on the ground. That's why. Anyway, but they're very fascinating bird. Anyway, we started a family. I didn't want to do field work again. I never did field work again after that. And so I finished my PhD, and there was a job at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is known for citizen science. And it was really because of parenthood and not wanting to do my own field work. I went there thinking, so they enlist bird watchers everywhere around the world to share their bird sightings, their observations of birds. And that's the data that I used for my research for 15 years. But as I started doing that, and as my kids grew up and whatnot, I got more and more interested just in citizen science and this phenomenon of people who aren't scientists sharing what they see with scientists and the discoveries that happen. And if you think about it, I mean, how many people noticed, let's say, a bird today? Raise your hand. Or noticed a bug or a spider? Noticed a smell in the air? Pollution, like some exhaust? How many people took a picture with their phone today? Okay, so that's a tool. So really you have the makings of being a citizen scientist. It's really anybody who can use their eyes, their ears, their minds, their phones, sensors, anything to make observations where they are and share those in networks that really can allow scientists to make discoveries that would otherwise not be possible. Because scientists can't be everywhere. They can't be in your home, in your backyard, in our cities all over. People have local knowledge that's really important. So as I learned about citizen science, I really started to see science very differently from how I thought it would be. And, I added a different, so I had related this earlier to this book, Stone Soup. I looked up to see if there was other equivalents. I don't know if this is a good thing or bad, but anyway, there was cactus soup. Okay. I don't know. Anyway, Stone Soup anyway, and cactus soup is sort of similar. They're just children's books about collaboration, cooperation. So in Stone Soup, some people come to a town where people are not trustful, they don't have enough to eat, everyone just has a little bit. They put a big pot of water to boil, and they add some stones or a cactus thorn, and they say, the whole town will feast on this soup tonight. And people think, oh, well, that's not gonna be very good, but I could make it better. Oh, here's some carrots. Oh, here's some onions. Here's some potatoes. Everyone adds a little bit. And then collectively, oh, it's a delicious soup. And that's what citizen science is like. It's this collaborative effort. So it's not working alone. It's highly collaborative with everyone sharing what they see or encounter. And it's not far away. It's not about nature being out in some place that's separate from where we are. It's about our daily lives. It's about what we encounter where we live. And that is part of our natural world and what we should try to understand. So it's embedded in our daily lives. And then it opens up this possibility for there to be these collective passion and clout that really goes about saving species and protecting our environment, and not just relying sort of on this hero mentality that one person's gonna come in and change all these and fix all these things, but that it's a collective effort. And then it makes science not be this elite kind of activity of a few, but it makes it an egalitarian sort of space. And so what does it look like? Well, in my field of ornithology, it looks like this, which is just an animation of barn swallows, of one species of bird that migrates, spending the summer in the US and spending the winter months across Central and South America. And these maps are created from tens of thousands of bird watchers in all of these countries, sharing millions of observations of birds that they see to a central database called eBird that has advanced our understanding of birds and bird migration, bird habitat use, advanced conservation, and also just helps birders know where to go birding. And it's a huge amount of infrastructure that makes this kind of system work. Anyway, but that's sort of a very iconic citizen science project that has participation in every country on the planet. And has anyone here ever eBirded? No? Have you eBirded? Okay, you eBirded. Yeah. Okay. So I started looking at citizen science and what we know in my field of ornithology and wondering what this really meant. I knew eBird had produced a lot of discoveries, but I wondered what it meant for the field of ornithology. And I started thinking about bird watchers in particular, and they do more than just make checklists of birds they see with binoculars. They monitor nests, so nesting birds. Some will catch birds in mist nets and ring them, put bands on their legs. And some, there's a history of collecting eggs, which go into museums, which are some iconic findings with that, such as like the impacts of DDT, came from historic egg collections that were by amateur ornithologists. Anyway, so given all these ways that bird watchers collect observations just in their hobby, I wondered what the impact was in what we know about birds and climate change. And so there was a paper that came out several years ago, just kind of as I was starting to think about citizen science. And it was by a different group, a research team, and they went through all the literature on migratory birds and climate change. And they synthesized it into 10 things that we know about this system, like that birds are breeding earlier, that the timing of spring is different for birds than for the caterpillars, than for when the leaves bud out, that migration patterns have changed, a whole bunch of things. And it was a very landmark paper. Well, me and my colleagues went through that paper, and we decided to classify all the literature on whether it was citizen science or conventional science, just professionals. So there was, we were able to there was 173 original articles that they cited. We were able to classify 171 of those. And what we found, I don't know, you can guess in your head, I guess, of what the percent was that used citizen science. And drum roll, it was 50%. So you can say that half of what we know about migratory birds and climate change comes from citizen science. But then we also looked at how many of those papers used the term citizen science or made it clear where the data came from. Anybody want to guess what that was? Any other guesses? Nobody read my paper. Okay, I'm used to that.
We'll do it.
Okay. Do it tonight. 0. So none of them used the term citizen science, even though they were all after the term had been coined. And so, there's been a big trend. Now it's more common for scientists to use the term in papers. Before, it was kind of hidden. You didn't want to, people would question the data quality. It wasn't something that you acknowledged. Anyway, so what I saw was, here is this huge impact of citizen science on our knowledge of climate change and birds, and yet it's so unacknowledged. And that was one big part of why, just from the scientist in me perspective, wanted to write a book about citizen science. And then the other part was to acknowledge all the work of the volunteers and of the people doing citizen science in this, and to really try to make citizen science a household word. And then this was just to show how things kind of have changed, but not too much. This was from Twitter today. So it says, congratulations to this fellow who does protein work, David Baker. He was named this year's highly cited researcher. That means his publications are so influential, okay, and this is in biology and biochemistry. So his research is largely based on citizen science, but it wasn't even acknowledged in the tweet. So I retweeted it, acknowledging it. So, because most of his data come from 2 systems, and one is a distributed computing system. I don't know if people are familiar with distributed computing. One example is Rosetta at home. Distributed computing is, so like the biggest, most powerful computers in the world are not one single computer or mainframe. The most powerful computers are distributed like this, and your phone, anything, when it goes idle, and then it can donate the GPU and CPU into solving some distributed computing problem. And some problems in biochemistry in particular are so computationally intensive, they require a distributed computing network to solve them. And his is with protein folding. And there's many, many diseases that were thought to be unrelated that it turns out have a common underlying cause related to how proteins misfold. And so that's what his big discoveries have been in. And it's from this, and there's hobbyists that donate their computer time. They're called overclockers. So this is an example. Like this man, he spends thousands and thousands of dollars on these very powerful computers to put them on these networks, and then he competes to see how powerful his computer is. Some of them use liquid nitrogen to super cool it. It's whatever, a big investment. Others can't afford to do that, so they join teams, and there's many fandom that create teams. So I don't know if people have heard of fandom, like Trekkies, they dress up like Star Trek characters, right? There's Potterheads, there's Whovians, they like Doctor Who. So these groups of fandom, they like make fan fiction and fan art. They're very creative. They like to share things on the web. And they also like to do community service. So one of the fandoms that is top of the charts in citizen science in Rosetta at home, they're almost always in the top 10, is this one, which is the Bronies. I don't know if people have heard of the Bronies, some have. So the Bronies they're typically young men, like age 16 to 22, who love the TV show My Little Pony, which was made for little girls. But they love the animation and the music and the stories, and so like in an authentic way. Anyway, so they're very tech geek-like, and so they have a distributed computing team. Anyway, what happens with distributed computing is that the screensaver will show the computer working out this three-dimensional problem of how does a protein fold. And people looked at that screensaver and thought, I feel like I could solve it better. And they said that to David Baker, the one that won the award. And he said, okay, well, let's do it. And so he created a game. He worked with game designers to make a distributed thinking type of citizen science project. And in this system, people also work in teams. It's called Folded. And they can manipulate this image of the protein, and they do figure out how it folds. And they solve this puzzle. And people were right. They are better than machines at solving these three-dimensional puzzles, because people have creativity and imagination and intuition with how to do it. And then it's opened up venues now for not just solving how existing proteins fold, but even designing new proteins and then synthesizing those in the lab. But anyway, but this problem of having so there's some that require a lot of computing. There's other problems or other fields that have a deluge of data. So this is an amateur astronomer, I mentioned her this morning, in New Zealand, who has her own telescope. But a lot of astronomy and citizen science is online. So this is Galaxy Zoo, which is, there's a telescope, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which is automated. So it's just automatically taking photos of galaxies throughout. And so there's many of these images that no human eye has ever seen. And there's thousands and thousands, space, right? So it's endless. And so it's a data deluge. And they tried to get graduate students to process them. They made a tiny dent, working 24/7, like for months. So they put them online, and people classify them. It's a micro task, right? They just spend a few minutes. Is it clockwise? Is it counterclockwise? What color is it? Whatever, different characteristics. They've been processing data. Lots of discoveries have come from this, some serendipitous. And it launched this whole online platform called the Zooniverse, which you can check out. It's not just astronomy. They have wildlife projects, like ones with camera traps. They have transcription projects of old texts, many different fields, archaeology ones, but it's all online. All ones that have too much data and they need help processing. Anyway, those are just some examples of some citizen science, but really it's in every field, every discipline that I looked, I saw different ways that citizen science was happening. And I'll just mention briefly, it's all different sorts of people. There's even non-literate communities that do citizen science, right? Because, so for example, pygmies in the Congo, they use what's called Cyber Tracker, which is like a GPS kind of device or smartphone type of device. And instead of words, it has icons, right? And they use that to map all the important places where they live so that it can be incorporated into forestry management plans so that they can preserve the places where they live that are important to them. It gives them voice in the Congo, where a lot of multinational companies are coming in to harvest the forests. Inuit in the Arctic, the indigenous people in the Arctic, are now finding their way of life disrupted by climate change. And so they're collaborating with climate change scientists to study climate change, using both their indigenous knowledge as well as conventional citizen science techniques, because that's where they live. They're there to measure the ice thickness, which is what's happening in that picture, and the wind and directions and all kinds of things. I'll just have one more example, which is of environmental justice, different from one that I mentioned this morning, which is, this was in New York, upstate New York, in a town called Tonawanda. And so those three there that are holding that bucket, that's a bucket, it's some supplies that they bought at like a Home Depot, like just a regular hardware store. They assembled this bucket to sample air quality. And because they live in what's called a fence line community. So they're surrounded by industries. And you can even see in the picture, industries aren't in there, but it's all the railroad and the power lines and the highways, and then it's industry. And it's a heavily polluted, poor neighborhood. And people have all sorts of very strange illnesses, cancers, and very odd smells. So they took an air sample, which had very high levels of benzene, deadly levels of benzene. And it triggered our EPA to finally investigate, because the EPA schedules inspections of all the factories, and everybody passes inspection. So then they put out air samplers in a grid, like a set thing, so they could triangulate and figure out who was the source. And they found it was this guy who ran Tonawanda Coke, like a steel kind of industry. And they did a surprise inspection. And they were releasing tons of benzene. So it was very intentional. And this was, so it was initiated by citizen science, and it was the first time in US history that someone was convicted in criminal court and served jail time for polluting on people. And it used to be, not that long ago, that people went to jail trying to stop pollution from happening, protesting, and now people are going to jail for polluting. And being able to gather data like this and have that be accessible through simple tools to people is really helping change that dynamic and who has the power in that situation. So, and it scared some states. Wyoming then, different state, but they passed a law that basically outlawed citizen science, making it as part of, you can't go on certain lands, public lands, certain private lands, to sample water or anything. But then this year, just in October, it was very exciting, that law got overturned. It was ruled unconstitutional, which was a really big step. And at the same time, though, just looking forward as to how far we've come in citizen science, I'll just do a few examples from the US and globally. In the US, we have this thing called the Competes Act, which is sort of like it's a huge act related to keeping the United States competitive globally. Anyway, but this last time it was renewed, right between the Obama and Trump administrations, we got this act added to it, the Federal Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act. And that was huge because it basically now says in law that our federal government has the rights and responsibilities to carry out citizen science and engage the citizenry in research. And so now there's this citizenscience.gov. It's a federal community of practice on citizen science, and there's over 70 federal agencies that are part of this community of practice, starting to learn how to do citizen science. And they have a toolkit and a catalog. And the catalog is actually SciStarter, which is a site that I work with. SciStarter is the largest listing of citizen science projects in the world. They list projects, they work with the Australian database, the European database. Anyway, and we're starting to make different instances for different countries, just so people don't have to reinvent that infrastructure. So if anyone gets motivated for citizen science here, SciStarter can be repurposed.
Let me interrupt you. Is there anything from Mexico in that?
In that database, a little bit, but not too much. It really needs to be sort of replicated and translated, I think, ideally. There's their Earth Day 2020 is already planning a big citizen science event, like global initiative, where they hope to get 1 billion people or something like that, some crazy number, participating in citizen science and sharing data. And this is actually partly funded by the US State Department, and then working with the Earth Day Institute. And they're trying to work around the globe. Another global initiative is the Citizen Science Global Partnership, which launched at a recent UN meeting. And their first big thing that they did was to work with Mosquito Alert, which is a citizen science project that started in Spain, and turn it into Global Mosquito Alert. So they are choosing projects that address global challenges, in this case, the spread of mosquito-borne diseases, and which is changing rapidly, especially with climate change. And so they're picking big initiatives like that are globally relevant challenges that really require people to participate and share observations, and turning them into global projects. Another thing that the Global Partnership is doing is investing in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, right? And so each of these goals has a bunch of targets, and each target has indicators. For many of those targets, there's not indicators on how to measure them, because conventional science can't measure them. It really requires citizen science efforts to really assess and see if those targets are being met. And so we're working on creating those and filling those gaps. And there's a European Citizen Science Association, an Australian Citizen Science Association, sort of the one that's called Citizen Science Association. It's really sort of based in the US. And then there's one that's launching in Asia, Citizen Science Asia. There's one that's launched in Africa. They don't have a logo yet. And so we're waiting for Central and South America to really have a citizen science association. And then the associations have been working together we have created a journal, for scholarly exchanges, as well as a conference. We're hosting the next one in Raleigh. Should I do cartoons to end, or should I?
Yeah, we have like 10 minutes.
Should I do it?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just summarize citizen science. I have sort of a cartoon scenario that I don't know if people can. Do you want to read it? You read it. You read My pronunciations.
Yo voy a ser lector en español. Lo que sigue será dicho por gente de palo con esta negativa. No solo representamos a la gente delgada, gente blanca o los calvos. A menos que se indique lo contrario, la gente de palo son genéricos representando gente de todas formas, edades, etnicidad, raza y género. Tenemos este cuento porque nuestro núcleo somos los mismos. Muchos se preguntan de dónde viene el conocimiento. El statu quo dice que científicos crean conocimiento dentro de esta caja negra. Comunicadores científicos traducen y diseminan nuevos conocimientos en la lengua común de la gente de palo. Un nuevo estudio sobre olfativa aliviar, repertorio del gen receptor, bla, 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 bla.
Do you know what that means? Yeah.
Aves pueden oler. Es decir, las aves pueden oler.
This one I have to, I guess, go a little bit English on you. So, but so to pause in that, just a history thing. So a lot of the way that humanity has progressed has been by reducing restrictions around the spread of knowledge. Knowledge sometimes produced by scientists, and these are just a trip down history lane, which one example is Michael Servetus from 1553. He was the first man to figure out our pulmonary circulation, how blood flowed between the heart and the lungs, right? Because it's very tricky. But he published that in a book called The Restoration of Christianity, which was considered heresy at the time. So John Calvin ordered that he have the book tied to his leg, that he was tied to a stake, and he was burned alive. 3 copies of his book did survive, and they became the founding doctrine of the Unitarian Church. But 100 years or so, or a little less later, Galileo, he was under house arrest, right, for believing in the Copernican view of the solar system. Anyway, I like to tell any scientists in the room or people who get their papers rejected from publication that they should never complain about that, getting a rejection on email, because this is what rejection used to look like in the past. Okay, that's rejection of scientific ideas. Now we just resubmit. Anyway, but and then even today, it's still an issue, not for religious or philosophical reasons, but just for economic reasons. And what the scientific discoveries are located behind a paywall. Like you have to pay to access, typically you have to pay to access that scientific information. And so there's been efforts to challenge that. So for example, Aaron Swartz in 2011 went onto MIT campus. Aaron was, as a young adult, he invented Reddit. And then as a younger adult, I guess he was an activist for open science. Anyway, he went onto MIT campus and he started taking all the knowledge that was protected behind a paywall and opening it up to the public as a political act. He said it is immoral to have knowledge not accessible freely to everyone, right? He's a Wikipedia generation. Everyone expects it to be free, but it's not. Anyway, they threw the book at him in terms of copyright law, and he was facing many decades in jail and no plea bargain, and sadly, under that pressure, he committed suicide. Around the same time, Alexandra Elbiankin started Sci-Hub. She still runs this. It's like a Robin Hood. It's an illegal site where anyone can go and access scientific papers because she steals them. And the US has had injunctions to try to shut it down, but it's located offshore, whatever. Anyway, my point here, though, is that this is a contested area of simply sharing knowledge. But when we talk about citizen science, it's not about just sharing knowledge. It's about sharing the process of creating that knowledge, right? That whole process, and opening up that and saying that everyone has access to that system, not just a few.
We just have 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
For you to have.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm done with that. But
Okay.
so.
Con la ciencia ciudadana destruimos la caja negra y trabajamos juntos. Tenemos mucho en común. Todos hacemos observaciones, todos somos inquisitivos, todos podemos hacer experimentos, todos pensamos y maravillamos, todos somos creativos, todos estamos motivados por el descubrimiento, todos disfrutamos haciendo cosas. Todos aportamos lo que sabemos. Cuando enfrentamos problemas grandes, el conocimiento científico no es suficiente. Nos necesitamos mutuamente, es decir, capital social, para descubrir y usar los conocimientos para llegar a la solución.
Thank you.